Since the advent of the internet, there's been an explosion of ideas, some of them brilliant, which usher in for mankind change for the better, and some which promise the precise opposite. Many also fall between two stools and could be described simply as harmless. Ideas so bonkers that we tolerate them only for their comedy value. Chief amongst these are the flat earthers. Although there is an overwhelming amount of evidence to confirm that the world is indeed a sphere, these characters continue to insist that it is as flat as a beer coaster. Nothing, it seems, will shake their conviction, and the people who embark upon this fool's errand are compelled to go back to first principles. But that conviction, although almost certainly wrong, does in fact do us a service. How can I prove that the world is a globe? I know it's supposed to be true. Do I have the evidence necessary to refute the flat earthers' claims? As a young man in 1989, I went to Australia and remained convinced that I did go there and that there is a wonderful country called Australia on the other side of the world. That is, on the opposite side of the globe. I was there for 11 months and did a whole circuit, much of it on a motorcycle, and I've never been anywhere else even remotely like it. But what do I know for sure? All I know definitively is that I got on an aluminium tube and 14 hours later I got off. When I did get off, the scenery was all different. The thermostat was cranked right up, and although everybody still spoke English, it was with an Aussie accent. But did I religiously track my progress over the land and sea? I didn't. And if I had, how could I have been sure about that progress when over the clouds? How can I be sure that the 14 hours locked into that tube wasn't merely time the matrix mechanics required in order to get the eucalyptus trees in place and for them to get up to Australian working temperature? The truth is, I can't be sure about any of it. So much of what we take for granted is based on faith. Faith in believing what we are told. Told by institutions that we have grown up to respect and to believe that we are being told the truth. Truth that has been nurtured over decades, centuries even, by the openness of said institutions to transparency and by their willingness to be challenged and to have their workings exposed to public scrutiny. And this was an important principle instigated in us from childhood when studying things like mathematics. Even if we didn't solve the equation, marks were given for showing your workings. Conversely, those who didn't show their workings and presented the teacher with a list of pristine correct answers were rightfully viewed with suspicion. And those inner workings have been suspiciously absent of late. The BBC, or the British Broadcasting Corporation, to give it its laughably dishonest title, is the prime example of a loved, yes, loved and trusted institution that has corrupted itself beyond recognition. Many people have for some time begun to trust the opacity of the BBC, but it is only in the last 5 years, years in which information has been much more readily available to those who had the nous and the interest to seek it themselves, that this corruption has been readily visible to all except the most myopic. Unless the BBC reforms itself radically back to the institution that it is supposed to be, in the 7 years that remains until its charter is to be renewed in 2027, it may be the first of our corrupt institutions to disappear. An increasing number will say good riddance, and I'll be one of them. But far from the BBC being an isolated case, it's the norm. In fact, an institution that does what it says on the tin has become the exception rather than the rule. A National Health Service that avoids treating genuinely sick people back to health, in place of diverting most of its immense resources towards eliminating an overwhelmingly mild virus a police force that does not enforce the law, a border force that doesn't enforce borders, an education system that indoctrinates rather than educates, a navy that doesn't repel invaders that arrive by sea, a representative parliament that doesn't represent. The list goes on. Why is it that our institutions are so enfeebled and so ineffective that they seem incapable of filling even their most basic responsibilities? Well, it isn't because they are incapable, although incompetence remains a feature of most of them. The NHS, staffed by almost 1.5 million people, was financed to the tune of £114 billion in the 2018 to 19 tax year, which of course doesn't include the current COVID fiasco. The police force has never had more powers than it has now to enforce the law. The BBC, with over 20,000 employees, is perfectly capable of reporting the facts of the news without lying to us, considering it receives around £4 billion from the licence payer. The Coast Guard and the Royal Navy have more than enough hardware and resources to prevent rubber dinghies with outboard motors from crossing the 22 miles from France to England with 20 fighting-age men on board. The Navy is of course one of our 3 armed services. Armed services that, as it happens, genuinely impressed even Tony Blair so much that he was reported as wondering why all Britain's institutions weren't as effective at accomplishing a given task. So if it isn't that they are incapable, logic dictates that there must be another reason for their ineffectiveness in accomplishing the task that the British people, the taxpayer in essence, finance them to accomplish. But these institutions, having grown fat on the taxpayers' trust, as well as their coin, have become less accountable rather than more so, the bigger and more powerful they have got. And with this increased clout has come less accountability to the public and more, much more, focus on sustaining themselves as institutions in themselves rather than as the public servants that they should be. And one way of protecting yourself, your boss and the institution that employs you is to pull down the blinds and make it increasingly difficult for outsiders, i.e. the public, to scrutinise what you may be up to. The institutions, having traded on decades of trust from the public, are now resolutely refusing to show their workings. And like our maths teacher, we should be especially suspicious, not just of their workings, but of their motives. And this is where the conspiracy theories breed. And I use that term advisedly, in the full knowledge that it is a stick to beat anyone who questions the official narrative that is fed us. But when you don't have facts, or at least ones you can rely on, you have to have theories as to why something so obviously easy to achieve is not actually being achieved. The Royal Navy, which is a tiny shadow of its former self, still has 77 commissioned vessels, every single one of which, apart from HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, is more than capable of intercepting a rubber dinghy with an outboard motor. So why are they getting across the Channel unhindered? Is it a conspiracy theory to deduce that they are not being intercepted because there is no political will to stop them? Is it a conspiracy theory to believe that, for some reason we are not being told, a decision is being made somewhere to let them come, or even that they are being encouraged to come? If that is the case, I dare not speculate as to the reasons. Similarly, are those who wonder why our children are being taught that the country they belong to has been a uniquely malevolent force in world history, despite plenty of evidence to the contrary, to be dismissed as conspiracy theorists. Are those who wonder why our government has crashed our essentially healthy economy into a brick wall and saddled our children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren with a lifetime's worth of debt to be ridiculed as part of the tinfoil hat brigade? And are those who have had the temerity to question the morality of allowing gangs of Muslim men in dozens of towns up and down the country to gang rape and sodomise underage girls for the sake of community relations to be smeared with that lunatic label? For any of you that don't know, the term conspiracy theory comes from the Kennedy assassination. If you believe anything other than the official Warren Report conclusion that Kennedy was killed by the lone gunman Lee Harvey Oswald, then you are, by definition, in this case, a conspiracy theorist. The Warren Report concluded that only 3 shots were fired. If you believe that there were 4 or 5, which Oswald did not shoot, and there was another gunman, then Oswald conspired with someone else. Hence, a conspiracy. And that's even if Oswald was the shooter. And because the Warren Report dismissed so much evidence in order for its conclusion to fit its theory that Oswald was the lone gunman, the alternative theories, perhaps we should call them, have flourished in the intervening years and have sowed much distrust about the nature, not just of the US government, but of all governments and all authorities ever since. My feeling is that the murkiness of the Kennedy assassination has resulted in our widespread dystopian worldview. It is also my view that people tend to believe the theories that fit in with their worldview and find evidence to support that. A confirmation bias, if you will. Of the big 5 conspiracy theories, JFK, the moon landings, the death of Princess Diana, September the 11th, and now coronavirus, the death of Diana mostly fits into this category. People like to think of Princess Diana as the beautiful, tragic victim of an uncaring and malevolent British establishment, something that Prince Andrew's alleged exploits have done nothing to dispel. But I include myself in this character trait. For the record, I don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman, or even that he was guilty at all, for reasons too numerous to go into now. But I freely admit I was influenced by Oliver Stone's brilliant but flawed film. Call me naive, and I'm open to being persuaded otherwise, but I think the US government was involved, but it was an aberration. And since I think it was an aberration, I don't believe that the US government did 9/11 to itself, despite being yet to be convinced by what happened to Tower 7. I believe that they faked some of the moon pictures, but that doesn't mean they didn't go there. And although Diana's death was blamed on the driver, my thoughts are that the paparazzi were really responsible. I don't think MI6 were involved, but maybe that's just because I despise the British press even more than I despise the British intelligence service, although that's a close-run thing. And so we come to COVID-19, and I find myself in a bit of a bind, which is one of the reasons I haven't posted in a while. It's coming up to 4 years that I've had a telly, probably over 2 years since I stopped listening to BBC Radio 4, and coming up to a year since I stopped buying a newspaper, so I remain out of the orbit of the mainstream media. Whilst that's been a good thing in some ways, not least for my mental health. I used to have Radio 4 come on with the alarm at 6 a.m, which meant I didn't actually want to get up. Because now I get my news from the internet. That is just as selective at the BBC. That is just as selective as the BBC, even at their worst. And that's not good for impartiality. And I find myself in conversation with friends who often have a completely different viewpoint from me. And like everyone else, I am influenced not only by Twitter and YouTube, but also by the people I meet, and mostly by my friends. Luckily, I do have friends from across the spectrum that hopefully keep me in some kind of balance. I have 3 friends in particular, all of whom are very intelligent and critical thinkers, and all of whom are deeply moral people. One is on the traditional left, and two others who were on the left but who are what you might call a pragmatic centrist, and one who is now on the identitarian right. And I take my cues from them. But I do feel myself drifting further and further away from the left, partly because the left, as we traditionally understood it, has probably ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, having been captured lock, stock and barrel by the bastardised woke nutcases who are currently attempting to burn down Western civilization. And with each of their arguments rattling around inside my head, I attended the Unite for Freedom demo in Trafalgar Square on Saturday, wondering if I was supporting the right or the wrong people. I went on the train determined not to acquiesce by wearing a mask, and as it happened I was never challenged, so never had to stand up in the heroic defiance that I imagined. But as I got closer to the centre of the action, I saw more and more people who obviously were anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers, and I got carried along in this vein, as you do. And there were a lot of speakers, most of them medical professionals, recounting their experiences and pouring scorn on the whole idea of the coronavirus being very serious at all. But there were other things that were tangential to the main theme of anti-lockdown. And one of these was a guy who was warning about the dangers of 5G. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, I think that 5G is a very dangerous development, even if only the official claims for it are to be believed. It advances the surveillance grid ever further and is being introduced to facilitate the so-called Internet of Things, which aims to make everything from your toaster to your car Internet enabled, which of course also means surveillance enabled. Now, for those for whom convenience is everything, they will be 5G's most willing slaves. But for those of us who worry about ever more intrusive surveillance and the systematic destruction of not only our anonymity and our privacy, but also our own human agency, this is yet another development on the road to a surveillance hell. But I don't know enough about the health implications of it to make any pronouncements about its safety. For me, the surveillance implications are bad enough, and bad enough on their own to make a case against it. But this guy seemed to know all about it, to the extent he was suggesting that kids should not be allowed back to school because it was eventually going to kill them by frying their brains and turning all of us into electronic receivers that will be able to be picked up at will by the authorities. And this seemed to belong definitively in the realm of conspiracy theory. And once again it got me thinking, was I in the wrong place? One of the chants that was doing the rounds was, choose your side. Was I choosing the wrong side? The patchy, incomplete and partial evidence that I receive through social media is quite obviously one-sided. But then so is the official line, as evidenced by when I used to listen to the daily COVID press release. But what also has dawned on me over these past few months is that for a normal person doing a normal job with a normal family and home life, and with a normal amount of time to devote to this kind of stuff, it is quite impossible to speak with any authority on what is true and what is not. So what to do? Whose side should I choose? How can one navigate a path through this fog? Sometimes, in the absence of facts, perhaps because you cannot ascertain the facts, or that you so distrust those who are providing them, you have to make a judgment based on something else. You have to make a judgment based on your instinct. And you do have to make a judgment. You have to make a judgment on what is actually happening. Some say follow the money. That's a fairly sound principle, considering the state of greed in the world. But I'm not a financial investigative journalist, and like it or not, I have a job to do. I've got bathrooms to refit, toilets to unblock, and dripping taps to fix. It's not very glamorous, but it's what I do. And in order to still have somewhere for myself and my wife to live, I do have to continue to do it. Much as I would like to ditch the plumbing and bestride the internet, like Douglas Murray, Sam Harris or Brett Weinstein. Despite the earlier scare stories of 500,000 dead, judging from how things have unfolded, COVID-19 seems only to be lethal to people over 70 with a serious pre-existing condition. And this is just not internet anecdotal, with a senior ITU consultant confirming this to me, without me expressing any doubt about the official narrative. The great majority of anyone under 70 are not at risk, and for children and young people, it seems as if the risk is thankfully almost non-existent. The impressively quickly assembled Nightingale hospitals appear to have, after all, not been needed, and are all standing idle and have quietly been closed or mothballed. Much over-reporting seems to have been done with regard to deaths, with COVID being attributed as the cause of death, even when no post-mortem was carried out. And for this, we have wrecked the economy and have allowed Parliament to enact the most draconian powers over the population in our lifetimes. And as usual, we have allowed the government to trade our liberties for trust in them. As usual, we have allowed ourselves to be manipulated into acquiescing, supposedly for the common good. We have stayed at home. We have kept our children from school. We have shamefully allowed our loved ones to die without us at their bedside. Be a local hero, they say. What's heroic about that? Initially, we tried to get on board and do the right thing, but as usual, we have been played. And now, months after the peak of infection, we are now being told that we have to wear face nappies. The virus, if it ever existed as a serious threat, is over. In the absence of any facts to back up their reasoning, my instinct tells me that there is something else at play here. My instinct tells me that the destruction of hundreds of thousands of small businesses has something to do with the fact that Jeff Bezos is $30 billion richer than he was at the start of this lockdown. My instinct tells me that track and trace is not the benign, life-saving infrastructure of a kindly government, but instead just another attempt to keep us all on an electronic leash. My instinct tells me that the imposition of masks is a test of how compliant we are. I haven't worn a mask anywhere and have scarcely been challenged, since without an Act of Parliament, it is not law. Not yet, despite what all the signs say. My instinct tells me that if we acquiesce to mask wearing, the completely unnecessary mandatory vaccine is next. And if it's so unnecessary, which it appears to be, why would it be mandatory? Why? Trust your instincts, your primal, animal instincts. In a world of smoke and mirrors, it's probably the only thing you can trust.